It's time for a Big Blue Kickoff Live.
Nobody can ever tell you that you couldn't do it, because you did.
On Giants.com.
You know what I saw? New York Giant pride.
And the Giants mobile app.
17-14 is the final. One touchdown, we are world champions. Believe it, and it will happen.
Part of the Giants Podcast Network.
Let's go out there like a bunch of crazy dogs. Have some fun.
Welcome to Monday's edition of Big Blue Kickoff Live here on Giants.com as well as the mobile app. He's Paul Dottino. I'm Lance Meadow with you for the next 60 minutes as it was a relatively lengthy weekend without Giants football because they played on Thanksgiving. So we'll recap that game.
I'm having withdrawal, Lance. I'm having withdrawal.
You're having some withdrawal. Well, we'll try to get you through it somehow, Paul. I know it was probably very tough.
Can we fast forward to Sunday, please?
Well, and that's going to be one heck of a game, given the fact that Washington now has won 6 of 7 and is just a game back of the Giants. So we'll certainly get into that. And a reminder, you can interact with us multiple ways. Give us a ring, 201-939-4513. You can also hit us up on Twitter, hashtag Giants Chat. And a reminder, you can find the archive of the show on our entire podcast network on the Giants mobile app, podcast platforms everywhere, and at Giants.com/podcast. So, Paul, let's start with the Dallas game because we didn't have a show on Friday. So this is really our first opportunity to recap and go over what transpired on Thanksgiving as the Cowboys ultimately won 28-20. They sweep the season series, and it was really a tale of two halves, you could argue, for both teams. Giants had a 13-7 lead at the break. Dallas scores 3 touchdowns on each of its first 3 possessions. But I look at this game, it's about missed opportunities, Paul. Giants had 2 interceptions. They only scored 3 points. And then Dallas was aggressive, remember, going for it on 4th and 2 early in the game. And all the Giants wound up getting was a field goal because they had multiple penalties on the ensuing drive. So Giants really, first half, they go into the locker room really playing the coulda, woulda, shoulda game under all those circumstances.
I felt as though the Giants were behind in the game, even though they had a 13-7 lead at halftime. I told somebody down on the field, I said, this does not bode well. They should be ahead by much more than this. They have squandered opportunities. They have basically given the keys to the door to the Dallas Cowboys. And you know that the war of attrition is going to catch up to the Giants. This is not going to be a second-half game for them because they just don't have enough of their regular bodies. So it was only a matter of time before Dallas was going to mount an assault. Now, for the Giants to be able to survive that assault, they were going to have to build up a bigger cushion. And they gave themselves chances to do that, but failed. And that's why I felt at halftime, it felt to me like, okay, they're behind, because they don't have a big enough lead to hold on to this thing. And then when Dallas came out and drove that second-half kickoff right down the field, they totally put their hands around the throat of the game. And then when Barkley drops the 4th down throw by Jones, which was a bit off, but certainly in the box, and one that Barkley has to catch right then and there, you just knew. And, of course, Dallas then goes on to score on their ensuing next 2 possessions with consecutive touchdowns. I mean, you just knew. By that point, the dam had sprung so many leaks, there was no saving the village.
Yeah, the Giants, let's face it, they could not keep up with the Cowboys. I mean, that to me is the best way to describe things. They could not get off the field on 3rd down on defense. Dallas was 7 of 11. And then here's now the second straight week in a row, Paul. What did the Lions do in the red zone? 4 touchdowns, 5 opportunities. Well, Dallas was one better. They were 4 of 4. So that means that now the last 2 opponents have gone 8 touchdowns and 9 red zone opportunities. That was a strength of the Giants' defense. That disappeared over the last 2 games. 3rd down defense was also a strength. That has been a bit of an issue. Those things, you got to clean them up, especially based on the upcoming opponents. But to your point about how you still felt they were behind, I would absolutely agree with you. And it goes back to my old philosophy. Time of possession is great. It's all about what you do with it. Dallas, they had the ball for a lot more than the Giants. What did they do? They finished with touchdowns. The Giants, they barely had any at-bats in the second half, Paul. You mentioned the 4th and 1. Then the next possession, 5 plays a punt. Then another turnover on downs. And then they finally get a late touchdown. But let's face it, the game was pretty much out of hand at that point.
Sure.
So there wasn't a lot of substance, I guess my point is, with those second-half possessions.
No, and I think the disappointing thing from the Giants' perspective is that, we've been talking all year about next man up, which has been good enough against lesser opponents. But now you're stepping up in competition. You're now going from the middleweights to the super middleweights, if you will, or even the light heavies. And what you find out there is that next man up, especially when you're going another level or two deeper, it's just not good enough to get it done. Which, in all honesty, Lance, we all understood that. I mean, this was not a mathematical equation that surprised us. And they're playing Washington now in a literally look, the Giants' season comes down to the two Washington games. They can afford to split and still be in pretty good shape. If they win the two games against Washington over the course of the next 3 weeks, they're going to make the playoffs. It would be almost impossible for them to not if they were to beat Washington twice. But they've got to beat them at least once, in my opinion, to have a realistic chance of making it. And it starts with this home game on Sunday, and that's why the war of attrition becomes another part of this equation. How many Giants injured players are going to be able to make it back for Sunday's game? Whether it's Bredesen, Ojolari, could it be Evan Neal, could it be Bellinger? We're not 100% sure which of those sick guys or hurt guys are going to be able to play. But that, to me, is a huge key for them to be able to win this game at MetLife.
Especially for the sake of depth. Now, Washington's not as high-scoring of a team as the Cowboys, but their defense has been playing very well. As you notice, some of the scores, especially last game against the Falcons yesterday, they come up with a deflection by Daron Payne, and then Kendall Fuller comes through with the interception in the end zone. They hold off the Falcons by 6. It'll be also interesting, speaking of returning players, Chase Young did not make, Paul, his season debut yesterday. Does he now come back after obviously tearing his ACL midway through last season? That's another storyline from Washington's perspective. But, yeah, here we go. I mean, we said these 4 games were going to define the season. Nothing has drastically changed. But I will say this, Paul. Even if in the hypothetical world that you laid out they do split, keep in mind, the other team that is in the hunt is Seattle. And what did Seattle do to the Giants? They beat them head-to-head. So even if you do split, Seattle is another team that you have to be concerned with, depending on obviously what Washington does outside of the Giants game. So that's the wild card in all of this, because the Seahawks, they already have had a head-to-head matchup with the Giants. But you figure all of these NFC East teams that are now going to play each other down the stretch, because right now if the players were to start today, everybody would be in for the NFC East, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. I mean, it's unheard of for 4 teams in the same division to make the playoffs. But now they're going to start playing each other. And what happens when teams play each other? They tend to beat each other up. So this is why we're going to start to separate the men from the boys, essentially, over these next few weeks.
Lance, I think it's quite clear, based on the separation that we saw last week, and it just further enhanced itself this past weekend. It's 8 teams for 7 spots. Yep. It's really that simple, okay? One team is going to be left out of this dance of musical chairs. One team. Now, if you look at the schedules, Giants have a tough one. Washington has a really tough one also. Seattle, not so much. Now, the Giants do have a 1-game lead over Seattle.
Yep.
Okay, so they've got that tiny little bit of breathing room right now, but you're correct, because Seattle won the head-to-head. You really would rather not finish tied with them, because that's not going to bode well, because that eliminates one of the spots. It would go to the Seahawks, and now you'd be forced to go into a tie-breaking situation, or for that matter, a head-to-head record situation with Washington. That's why I'm saying, if the Giants split with Washington, okay, now at least it gives them a sporting chance to make it ahead of the Commanders if Seattle should grab the second wild card. That's why a split with Washington is necessary. Nothing less than a split will do. It's my feeling, if the Giants get swept by Washington, they're done. They're not making it.
Yeah, I mean, it would be very difficult under those circumstances, especially knowing they still have, obviously, 2 games with Philadelphia. They're playing the Vikings. I mean, it's no picnic coming up.
Right.
And
now,
we don't know.
If you sweep Washington, though, however, Lance, it basically puts the Commanders in really, really bad shape, because now you're going to move into such a good position regarding them.
Yep.
That they're going to be fighting Seattle then for the last spot, because the Giants are pretty much going to be in.
Well, you're 1 game up on Washington right now, to your point. If you sweep them, now all of a sudden it jumps to 3, but really it jumps to 4 because you hold the tiebreaker on them, given the fact that you swept.
Yes.
So, huge advantage.
This is it. It's a 2-game season, is really what it comes down to. Everything that we have seen since July, when training camp started, comes down, in all honesty, basically to a 2-game season. It's what they do against Washington. Well, I tried to tell people last week, the Dallas game, yes, it does affect your overall record. It certainly takes you out of the mix for the division, certainly probably solidifies Dallas more as one of the wild cards, and forget about finishing ahead of them in all likelihood. Okay, I get all of that. But if your concern was just to make the playoffs, that Dallas game was a microscopic crumb. It's the 2 Washington games that will determine the Giants' fate. It's really that simple.
And interestingly, Washington has the Giants back-to-back because they have the bye in between. They're playing them this week, then they're off, and then they play them again Week 15 at home, whereas the Giants obviously have the Eagles in between. So the dynamics, Paul, of the scheduling is a little bit different.
Yeah.
You just wonder, does the rest, especially, when you get a late bye, and sometimes that could give a team a surge. We saw it with Tampa Bay 2 years ago when they won their final 4 games and went on to win the Super Bowl. Does that give them a little bit of a push, considering they haven't had their bye, and clearly the Giants have had it already? So I'm not saying that that's a huge influence, but it doesn't hurt, I'm sure, from Washington's perspective, that they're going to get a little rest in between both of those games.
Well, especially when you consider between that sandwich, the Giants have to play Philadelphia.
Yep, exactly.
And that's going to be a rock'em sock'em kind of game. Regardless of how it turns out, the Giants are going to get battered and bruised in that game. That's going to be a steel cage match. And so the Giants are in such a situation where we're hoping they get healthier this week, but then they got to come out of this game, and they got to come out of the Philadelphia game without being further injured or significantly hampered, because they will have to go down to Washington and play in a rematch. And it's not going to do them any good if they're going back down to Washington, down 9 guys on the injured list.
Well, I think the key position to watch is clearly the secondary, given what Dallas was able to do, because, not to get off topic, but the reason why, Paul, Dallas was 7 of 11 on third down, to me the killer was Cowboys did not have all favorable third downs in that game if you go back. They converted a 3rd and 11, a 3rd and 12, and a 3rd and 15 to Dalton Schultz on the touchdown. So if you're the Giants, you're like, we have the Cowboys where we want, but then they couldn't get off the field regardless of the down and distance. So does the secondary get some reinforcements? Or if they don't, do those guys learn from their mistakes? And also, here's the other thing. We talked about this last week, if you remember, leading into the Thanksgiving game. Wink went through this in Baltimore last season. He was down several corners, several safeties. Secondary struggled down the stretch of the season. Does he learn from what happened last season, combined with the Cowboys game, that maybe you can't leave guys on an island out to dry if you don't have the heavy lifters on the back end of the secondary? Now, granted, I understand Washington poses a different challenge than Dallas, but in fairness, you still got Terry McLaurin, you got Curtis Samuel, you got Jahan Dotson, you got Logan Thomas. It's not as if they don't have guys that they can stretch the field here coming up on Sunday.
The second half of that game, the Giants are playing Nick McLeod full-time on one boundary, had never played more than 39 snaps in a game, and all of a sudden he's playing 75 in Dallas. Like I said, the war of attrition. In the first half, when the Giants had the 13-7 lead, I thought the secondary held up well. They allowed Dallas to get many contested catches simply because Prescott was throwing darts that were right on the money, and their guys simply refused to drop the ball. There were 3 passes in particular where Giants defensive backs were right there. They whacked at the receiver after the ball was caught, and they still held on. I gave tremendous credit to Prescott for his throws and to the receivers on the Cowboys who simply refused to let the ball hit the ground. Now, again, once the attrition set in, and now you're exposing McLeod and Rodarius Williams, who are forced into playing full-time situations out there on the boundary, and all of a sudden now guys are getting a little more room, And now, as Dallas has that snowball rolling downhill, the Giants' defense is exposed, and the coverage was not as good in the second half. And Dallas's receivers had more room, and they just continued to pile it on. But, I felt bad. I talked to Darnay Holmes in the locker room after the game, and I said, Darnay, there were a number of times you guys had blanket coverage. What's that frustration like when you know you're there? and the ball is just right in the middle of that bullseye, and the receiver just refuses to let the ball go. And he laughed. He's like, someday you got to give credit to them. They made the plays. They get paid too. And that was also part of why Dallas was able to stick around in the first half, because they were making those plays in the Giants secondary. That, in all honesty, I bet you half the teams in the league are having 2 or 3 drops there in that first half. But Dallas, they just wouldn't let the ball hit the ground.
Michael Gallup in particular, Paul, I would highlight. He made some really big catches. Where
Lamb had a couple too.
Yeah, it was equivalent to basketball, right? When a guy is posting up somebody down low, Gallup just got really good positioning, was able to jump up, make the catch, and Dalton Schultz is another one who made some nifty grabs, and no surprise. What's the common element with those two guys? They did not play in week 3. Okay? Cowboys got some reinforcements.
And they killed the Giants this time.
Took advantage. Correct.
Killed
exactly.
Them. And then how about the touchdown where, was it Lamb's toe?
Yep.
His ankle. His ankle. One hand. I mean, talk about ridiculous. That was typical of how the Giants' day was going. He makes this absolutely ridiculous, spectacular, no business-making grab in the back of the end zone, and simply because his ankle turned and hit the back line, it wound up going incomplete, and the touchdown came off the board. But it just would have been poetic justice if the touchdown had counted, because that's typical of the kind of grabs that the Cowboys were making all day long.
Now, in fairness, one play later, they wound up running it in anyway for 2 yards. So
yes, they did.
It didn't really make a difference. I'm sure Dallas may have something to talk about if they had to settle for a field goal under those circumstances. But, yeah, it was certainly a microcosm of the type of day, specifically in the second half, it was for the Giants. And we've seen these routines before where the Giants, one half is somewhat solid and the other half it's unrecognizable. And now that you're playing divisional foes, you can't have this Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde routine. I mean, that's one of the things that I'm paying attention to here down the stretch. Doesn't matter what the halftime score is. It's about what team shows up in the final 2 quarters. And against the Lions, where they were trailing by double figures, in fairness, in that game, but you were still within striking distance. And then the last 2 games, Paul, the first drive in the third quarter, that's another common element, right? What does Detroit do? They march down the field and they got a good return on special teams. Dallas, same thing. That almost, you could argue, has made or broken the Giants right out of the gates to start the second half.
Well, it was virtually a double dip.
Yep.
For Dallas, because the Giants did nothing with that
and
one
Detroit
possession.
Too, though, from
yes,
the previous game.
Same situation. Where at the end of the first half, the Giants did nothing with that possession, and it virtually became a double dip. This is a team that cannot afford to give up double dips.
Absolutely.
I mean, let's not kid ourselves. Now, I will tell you this. Looking at Heineke from the Commanders.
Heineke, yeah.
Yes, Heineke.
Think beer.
Heineke.
Think beer. Yes.
I just hope they kick Washington's Heineke is what I hope.
Oh, look at you pulling out
But in
the
any
punts.
event,
yes.
He has thrown picks in 5 of his 6 games since he took over for Wentz. Okay? So he does have somewhat of a propensity to turn it over. What the Giants can't do, Lance, is get a takeaway and then not convert it into points, specifically 7s. Because we know this game is going to be a drag them out, tug of war, down in the mud, slugfest. Okay? The rubber pellets out of that artificial turf are going to be flying like crazy on Sunday. And it's going to be up to the Giants to take advantage of every opportunity they get. You cannot squander opportunities in this kind of game against that Redskins defensive front, which is going to do everything they can to make it a lockdown, low-scoring affair.
Well, last point to piggyback off of what you're saying before we open up the phone lines, and I agree wholeheartedly with you, and this is, I think, getting overlooked. I mentioned Washington has won 6 of their last 7, but look at what they're holding opponents to. They held the Bears to 7, the Packers to 21, the Colts to 16. They lost to the Vikings. The Vikings only scored 20. The Eagles, okay, they, remember, upset them. They held Philly to 21. They did actually a really good job, better than most. The Texans 10 and the Falcons 13. The bottom line is this Washington defense has really, you could argue, been the heart and soul of this team right now, and they could potentially get Chase Young back. So don't expect that the Giants are going to come into that game. And granted, it hasn't been like that for the majority of the season where the Giants are lighting up the scoreboard. But I agree with you from the sense of this is not the Dallas game where it's a track meet, perhaps. This is field positioning, clawing it out, finishing in the red zone, getting a turnover, shortening the field, one of those grind-it-out type of affairs. It could very well be. Ugly football. The beauty of the NFL is you don't get style points like college football. It doesn't matter whether you win by 2, you win by 10. Makes no difference. Has no influence on the standings. But this Washington team has been extremely stingy, and that's going to put some more pressure on a Giants offense that has had its ups and downs in terms of putting points on the board.
Look at the total points for the season, Lance. Giants have been outscored by their opponents by 7. Washington's been outscored by their opponents by 3. Both teams want to play conservative offensive game plan, grind it out. Washington's got the two-headed monster with Robinson and Gibson. The Giants have Barkley, but they both want to primarily run the ball, grind it out on offense, try not to make mistakes, win the field position battle, and hope that their defense holds up. Now, Washington does it with their defensive front by getting a ton of sacks and a ton of pressure. Okay? The Giants' defense does it by being really good on third down and being really good in the red zone, although the war of attrition has certainly hampered their ability to do so. But in all reality, these game plans are not very different. They both have a general philosophy about how they want to win a game. They want to keep the game just about to the high teens, low 20s, and survive. That's what these two teams want to do. I mean, look, break out the steel chairs, break out the foreign objects, okay? Because we're going to see ourselves a steel cage match on Sunday.
So it's Hulk Hogan against King Kong Bundy to build a parallel for you in terms of we're looking ahead to Sunday's matchup between the Giants and the Commanders. Few reminders before we open up the phone lines. The Giants Huddle podcast, make sure you go subscribe. Podcast features a rapid reaction right after each game with one of our analysts, an episode midweek featuring an interview with a national analyst, and then a game preview featuring a long-form interview with a current Giants player, an exclusive sit-down with Bob Papa and head coach Brian Dable, and an opponent preview of that week's opponent. Search for Giants Huddle on your favorite podcast platform, or you can listen on the Giants app or at giants.com/podcast. Also, don't miss the second legacy game at MetLife Stadium. It is coming up this weekend. The team will be in their throwback uniforms from the 80s and the 90s. They host the Washington Commanders. The stadium is going to be branded in throwback designs, including an exclusive collectible pennant for the first 30,000 fans in attendance. Limited tickets are still available. You can visit giants.com/tickets to secure your seat today. Also, the Giants' official connected TV streaming app, Giants TV, brings original video content and game highlights on demand and direct to Big Blue fans. Giants TV is free. It's on Apple TV, Roku, and Amazon Fire TV, as well as the Giants mobile app. All right, let's open up the lines, 201-939-4513. Steve is in Connecticut. He joins us here on Big Blue Kickoff Live. What's happening, Steve?
Hey, guys, what's going on?
Hi.
Doing all right.
I
What's on your mind?
Two points, one on Dable and one on Odell. I just wanted to preface my point on Odell with two things. I think there's a big misconception and a narrative being put out there that the Giants are, quote unquote, year one of a rebuild. And I think going into the year, that's a fair take if you look at the new regime and you look at a lot of questionable players, right? You don't know about your quarterback, you don't know about your running back. A lot of the key players that you drafted, you're not sure about. But from hearing from you guys, and I think you agree that if Daniel's the answer and Barkley you want to give an extension to, and you look at Dexter and you look at some of the safeties and you look at the D-line, you're looking at a team right now that actually has a quarterback going into, coming off his rookie contract. You're looking at a running back that's going into his prime years on a contract. So you're not really, this is really the beginning of the Giants window, and the regime, being the fact that it's their first 2 years doesn't really dictate otherwise. And then the other point is that if you look at any quarterback in the last 5 years that has really been, risen to the top of the league as the new young gun, they all have one thing in common, and that is that their team has brought in, a big-time wide receiver or multiple wide receivers, whether it's Stephon Diggs, whether it's A.J. Brown, whether it's Tyreek Hill. There hasn't really been a quarterback that has succeeded without.
Well, in fairness, Cameron,
receivers.
If you're making the comparison, though, to Odell Beckham is not in the same category as any of those guys. So I really don't think that's a fair comparison.
No, 100%. But my idea is, Shane has done a great job, but that does not mean we can't criticize him, and it doesn't mean, giving up picks, whether it's a second rounder at the deadline or whether it's signing Odell. I think he should be doing all three. I think he should have gave up at the deadline. I think he should sign Odell to a two-year deal. I think he should then go in and draft a first rounder, because if you look at this team, there aren't a lot of units of this team that are missing big time. I mean, you could look at the linebacker spot, you could look at maybe a second cornerback, but really the big place that they're missing is really just at wide receiver, and that's why I think they should be investing 2 or 3 places in it. And I think, firstly because I think their window's starting now, and I also think because they need it for Daniel.
Well, I mean, I disagree with you from the standpoint of that it's so simple that it's just like 1 or 2 pieces that they're away from solidifying a lot of question marks on this team. And I think Joe Schoen understands that, and that's why he doesn't want to sacrifice draft capital. To your point, he could still address the wide receiver position in the upcoming draft. That ship has not sailed, so that's not necessarily out of striking distance. As far as giving Odell Beckham a 2-year contract, the guy's coming off a torn ACL. He hasn't played since the Super Bowl. Why would you want to commit to somebody when you haven't even seen him on the football field, and you could wind up, to your point, drafting a guy in the first round at that position? I don't necessarily think that adds up.
Well, I'll tell you like this. We know this very well over the last 10 years as Giant fans, that you're in a position to make the playoffs. You don't take that for granted. Just throwing it around that this is a rebuild year when you're 7-4.
Steve, I understand you don't take those things for granted. I'm not disagreeing with you. I mean, the Jets, I think, are of that mindset, given they made a quarterback change. Robert Saleh saying the same thing. We're 6-4. We haven't made the playoffs since 2010. I'm not just going to throw it away. I have no problem with that. What I have a problem with is it seems like you're of the mindset that Odell Beckham is the missing piece that takes them to the promised land. I disagree with you there. I don't think you put Odell Beckham on this team and this team gets 10 times better than it is currently. That's my problem.
Well then let me ask you, Odell and Jerry Jeudy, is that the difference? Where maybe
no, I don't think Jerry Jeudy, if you're bringing up somebody that was thrown around during the trade deadline, Jeudy also, has had issues staying healthy, and he's hurt right now, by the way. And the Broncos offense, which brought Russell Wilson into the equation, the last time I checked, they haven't necessarily lit up the scoreboard. So you're taking a guy away from a Denver team that has not lived up to expectations. You're going to put him in your offense mid-season, by the way, and all of a sudden he's going to build unbelievable chemistry with Daniel Jones, and that's going to take them up a notch. And I would say I don't necessarily think that would come to fruition as well.
Okay, well, I hear you. One more point about Dable. I think that with you guys, if I disagree with one thing, is that we could agree that he's done a great job and also agree to criticize him on one bad move. I heard your arguments about Adoree Jackson, one about it being coaching scared and the other one about, he could have got hurt on any play. But if you look at the percentages of punt returners, it's not close in getting injured. And I think it's not coaching scared. I think it's coaching smart. Arguably one of the most important players to his unit. You guys called him the MVP at the halfway point. And the same way you don't put a Daniel Jones back there or a Saquon Barkley, there's one guy you saw from the Dallas game. You just don't put him back there. You can find other guys to make fair catches. The Giants were averaging 5 yards on a punt return.
So Steve, then why did the Kansas City Chiefs do it with Tyreek Hill then? Can you explain that to me? Why'd they do it with Tyreek Hill when he was on the team?
Because, what I was going to tell you with Tyreek Hill is that he's a guy that that was one of his specialties. And I'll ask you like this: if you're so sure that it's coaching scared to do it, when Adoree comes back and that knee gets back to form or whatever, do they put him back there again? I have a feeling.
Well, it depends on if they can establish somebody at that position in between. And I would think probably considering he got hurt and he's valuable in the secondary, it may change their thinking, but I think a lot depends on, does somebody emerge at that position during the time that he's sidelined? That influences coaching decisions as well.
So you would put Barkley back there?
I would put if Barkley is the best option to return, I would absolutely consider putting Barkley back there. That's my philosophy. That's what I subscribe to. The best players, the most talented players, if they help your team in other facets, I have no problem utilizing them. I think that across the board, whether it's the Giants, the Cowboys, the Chiefs, the Steelers, it makes no difference to me.
Do you remember when Odell Beckham Jr. was with the Giants and they would throw him back there on returns every once in a while because they felt they needed something to happen? Do you remember that?
Or
maybe you were sleeping for about 5 years and had no clue as to what the team was doing.
No, they did not throw him back there. Check it up. I remember
they did actually, my friend.
Once was on a fake.
No, actually,
One
they
was on
did.
a
They
fake
did
Dwayne
throw him
Harris
back
against
there.
the
They did throw him back there on punt
in
returns.
a playoff game when they were down 20
Obviously,
points.
you did not watch, or you were sleeping for 5 years. One or the other.
No,
That's
in
okay.
a playoff game.
That's all right. Not a problem.
No, they did it twice.
Have a good day.
I remember
Well,
the 2 times they did it.
Steve, the bottom line is I'm bringing up Odell Beckham's statistics in terms of kickoff returns and punt returns. And if you look at the numbers, he had, on average, he had 21 returns in 2014. He had 10 returns in 2016. That's punts, okay? And he also, in between that, he had 2 in 2015 and then 8 in 2018. So the facts show that it's not accurate what you're saying, and appreciate the phone call. And listen, he could, Paul, I didn't mean to cut you off. I'll let you continue.
No, it's fine. I
Yeah.
just have problems listening to anybody trying to make a case when they can't even get the facts straight.
Well,
that's a huge problem.
You basically took the words out of my mouth. See, what I was going to say is callers could disagree with us. I have no problem. I welcome people looking at things differently. But when your argument is supported, and this is what you're getting at, Paul, in items that don't add up from a factual standpoint, we dismiss that. You can't make an argument based on fairy tales. Odell Beckham did return, and he was utilized more than just once over his career.
41 punt returns over his 5 years with the Giants.
So how can you make an argument they barely utilized him? I mean, it's ridiculous. Yeah.
If he only saw 2 of them, he was sleeping for almost 5 years, this guy.
Exactly. And I understand people are annoyed that Adoree got hurt. Fine. You could feel that way. We're not telling you not to.
Right.
But don't bring up things that did not happen. And then Tyreek Hill, who's another guy, because people were tired of me throwing out Antonio Brown, telling me Antonio Brown played in the 18th century, which is also ridiculous, but fine. So you want me to give you a more recent guy? Fine. Tyreek Hill. 2016 was his rookie year. He returned the ball 39 times on punts, 25 in 2017, 20 in 2018.
Here's the great example of all, Deion
Cordero
Sanders.
Patterson, too.
That's another one. That's very good from the Atlanta Falcons.
And
that's a good one,
And
Pearson.
Deion
Yep.
Sanders, the greatest cover corner maybe in history,
Well,
was
but
also
Paul, remember,
one of the
Deion
greatest
played
returners.
in the 16th century. That's what people are going to tell you.
Yeah.
He played in the 16th century.
Here's the problem. It's been done many times over the years.
Yep.
It's whatever that coach at that particular time feels he has to do. Now, are there times where it's worked out fine? Sure. Are there times where the guy has gotten hurt? Yeah, Jason Sehorn. Yes, Adoree Jackson. Yeah, it's happened. Hindsight is always 20/20, okay? You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. You have to play the game. You have to try to win the game. And if it means that that's what you got to do, then that's what you do. Now, I get it. Jackson got hurt, so everybody's really sour about it. Look, I'm not telling you that I would have put him back there. Chances are I probably would not have, okay? But my bigger issue is that when Richie James had the fumbles in Seattle and they decided to take him off punt return duty, he was also not doing anything in the receiving corps at the time. But yet he still had a roster spot. My only gripe with the Giants, it's not so much that Jackson was back there. My only gripe was if you're keeping Richie James on the roster, and he's not going to run routes in the offense, then he might as well be back there catching the punts. If you didn't want him catching the punts because he fumbled, then he shouldn't be on the team, because at that point in time, it was the only job that he had. So that would be my gripe. It would not necessarily be that Jackson was back there. It's that why did you keep Richie James on the roster if you weren't going to use him?
201-939-4513 is the telephone number. DeAndre Carter's another guy I want to throw out there for the Chargers. With Mike Williams and Keenan Allen a little bit banged up, he's been a solid wide receiver. He's their main return guy too. So we see starters being utilized in many different scenarios. Let's head back to the lines. Cameron is in Queens, joining us here on Big Blue Kickoff Live. What's happening, Cameron?
Hey, what's up, Paul and John?
Hi.
Or Lance. It's okay. I've been called worse.
Go ahead.
Okay. I just wanted to talk about if you've noticed the